The Flower in the Fold, a rhythmic sleep story of handmade pasta. Kitchen was quiet in that particular way that only happens when the world outside begins to fold itself into darkness. Julian stood at the threshold, one hand resting on the doorframe, and watched as the last threads of golden sunlight stretched across the wooden countertop before dissolving into dusk. The day had been long, not difficult, exactly, but full in the way days sometimes are, packed with small demands and half-finished conversations and the persistent hum of being needed by others. Now the house was Julian's alone. The floorboards creaked softly underfoot as Julian crossed to the center of the kitchen, where a heavy wooden counter stood like an island. It was scarred from years of use, marked with the faint impressions of countless knives and the pale rings left by hot pots. Julian's palms met the cool surface, and there was something grounding in that touch, something that said, "Here, now, this moment." The decision had been made earlier, during a lull in the afternoon, to spend this evening doing something slow, something with hands and time and patience, something that required nothing but presence. Pasta, from scratch. Fettuccine, to be specific. There was a simplicity to the idea that felt almost radical. No recipe pulled from a glossy website, no special equipment, no performance for anyone's benefit. Just flour, eggs, salt, and the quiet ritual of making something real. From her usual spot near the refrigerator, Ravioli appeared. She was a round, white cat with a face that looked perpetually surprised, as if she had just discovered something mildly scandalous about the world. Her fur was the color of fresh cream, and when she sat in a certain way, legs tucked beneath her, tail curled around her body, she resembled nothing so much as a soft ball of dough. She blinked slowly at Julian, then padded across the floor with the regal air of someone who owned the place and was merely allowing Julian to visit. "Evening, Ravioli," Julian murmured, and the cat responded with a chirp that was half meow, half trill. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a neighbor's wind chime sang a scattered, lazy tune. Julian reached up and pulled the chain on the small pendant lamp that hung over the counter. Warm light pooled downward, illuminating the workspace and leaving the rest of the kitchen in gentle shadow. The effect was cozy, almost womb-like. The world narrowed to just this: the counter, the light, the cat, the stillness. Julian's shoulders, which had been creeping upward all day, with a tension so familiar it had become invisible, began to drop. The muscles along the spine softened. Breath deepened. There was no rush here, no clock to watch, just the evening unfolding at its own pace, and the quiet promise of making something with nothing but time and attention. Ravioli settled onto a kitchen chair pushed slightly away from the table, her eyes half closing in that way cats have of appearing both utterly disinterested and deeply attentive at the same time. Julian stood for a moment longer, simply breathing, simply being, and felt the day begin to release its grip. The flour came first. Julian pulled the bag from the pantry, a heavy 5-pound sack of all-purpose flour, the kind with old-fashioned lettering on the front. It landed on the counter with a satisfying thump, the sound solid and real in the quiet kitchen. There was something deeply grounding about the weight of it, the heft of something so fundamental. Flour, one of humanity's oldest ingredients. Grain ground fine, the foundation of bread and pasta, and 1,000 different traditions stretching back through centuries. Julian untied the bag and folded back the top, revealing the pale, silky contents. The scent that rose up was faint, but distinct, earthy, almost sweet, the smell of wheat fields and sun and something ancient. A measuring cup hung on a hook nearby, and Julian used it to scoop out the flour, watching the soft powder cascade and settle. 3 cups, that would be enough. The flour mounted on the wooden counter, a small pale hill in the circle of lamplight. Julian's fingers smoothed it gently, evening out the shape, feeling the cool, fine texture. There was a meditative quality to even this small action. No hurry, just presence. Next, the eggs. Julian opened the refrigerator and selected 3 from the carton farm fresh eggs from the market, their shells a warm, creamy brown. They felt substantial in the palm, slightly warm from having sat out for a few minutes. There was something about the weight of a fresh egg, the fragile strength of the shell, that always made Julian pause. Whole worlds contained in these small ovals. Potential. The eggs went onto the counter beside the flour. Then a small dish of coarse sea salt, the crystals catching the light like tiny chips of quartz. A tablespoon of olive oil poured into a little bowl, its surface gleaming. And finally, a glass of water in case the dough needed a touch more moisture. 4 ingredients, that was all. Julian stepped back and looked at the collection. Flour, eggs, salt, oil. It seemed almost absurd how simple it was. 4 things. Nothing exotic, nothing rare. You could find these ingredients in almost any kitchen in the world. And yet, from these humble elements, something beautiful would emerge. There was a lesson in that, Julian thought. How often did we convince ourselves that we needed more tools, more ingredients, more resources, more of everything, before we could create something worthwhile? How often did we wait for the perfect conditions, the ideal moment, the complete set of supplies? But here, in this quiet kitchen, the truth was laid bare. You didn't need more. You needed these 4 things, and you needed time, and you needed your own 2 hands. That was enough. That had always been enough. Ravioli hopped down from her chair and approached the counter, her nose twitching as she investigated each ingredient in turn. She sniffed delicately at the flour, then at the eggs, her whiskers quivering with dignified curiosity. When she reached the olive oil, she paused, considering, then apparently decided it was beneath her notice, and sat down to groom a paw. Julian smiled. Even the cat understood. Simple was good. Simple was complete. The flour needed to become a crater, really like a small volcano waiting to be filled. Julian's hands moved with deliberate care, pushing the flour outward from the center, creating walls, shaping the mound into a ring with a hollow heart. The gesture felt ancient, elemental. How many hands had made this same shape over how many thousands of years? Grandmothers in Italian villages, cooks in restaurant kitchens, parents teaching children the old ways. The same motion repeated across time and distance, connecting Julian to an unbroken chain of people who had stood at counters and tables and kneaded dough and made something from almost nothing. The well took shape a pale ring of flour with an open center, just wide enough to hold the eggs. Julian paused, studying it, making small adjustments. The walls needed to be thick enough to hold the liquid, but not so high that they'd collapse inward. There was an engineering to it, a gentle architecture. Satisfied, Julian reached for the first egg. The shell cracked against the edge of a bowl, that clean, satisfying snap, and the contents slipped out into Julian's palm. The yolk sat there, bright and golden and perfect, while the white pooled around it. Julian's fingers gently guided the whole thing into the center of the flour well. Then the second egg. Crack, slip, settle. The third. Crack, slip, settle. 3 golden yolks sat in the center of the flour ring, their color almost luminous in the lamplight. The whites surrounded them, clear and viscous, catching the light. It was beautiful, absurdly so. Just eggs and flour, but the composition was perfect. The pale circle, the golden centers, the contrast of color and texture. Julian felt a small, quiet wonder rising in the chest. This moment right here, before anything had even begun to come together, this was already enough. Already beautiful. There was vulnerability in this moment, too. The eggs were exposed, held only by the fragile walls of flour. One careless movement and the whole thing would collapse. The yolks would break, the whites would run across the counter. It required trust. Trust in the process, trust in the structure, trust in your own ability to be gentle and careful. Julian added a pinch of salt to the eggs, watching the white crystals dissolve slightly as they touched the moisture. A small drizzle of olive oil followed, golden drops settling on the surface, and then came the moment of commitment, the moment of beginning. Julian's fingers touched the edge of the yolk very gently and began to beat the eggs with a fork right there in their flour well. The yolks broke, their rich color bleeding into the whites. The fork whisked them together, around and around, the motion steady and rhythmic. Gradually, flour from the inner walls of the well began to incorporate into the liquid. Just a little at first, the mixture thickened, becoming yellow and opaque. The fork kept moving, pulling in more flour with each rotation, and the well began to grow smaller as its walls tumbled inward. This was the delicate part. Too fast, and the walls would collapse entirely. Too slow, and the eggs would grow cold and difficult to work with. Julian kept the motion steady, patient, watching as the mixture transformed from liquid to paste to a shaggy, rough dough. Ravioli, ever the supervisor, moved closer to watch. In her approach, she brushed against the edge of the counter, and a small puff of flour lifted into the air, settling gently on her white whiskers. The effect was immediate and comical. She now appeared to be sporting a tiny, dignified mustache, like a distinguished gentleman from another era. Julian paused, fork in hand, and let out a soft laugh. "You look very scholarly," Julian told her. The cat, oblivious to her new facial accessory, merely blinked and continued her observation. The moment of lightness felt good, necessary, a reminder that this didn't have to be serious or perfect or anything other than exactly what it was, a person, a cat, and some flour in a quiet kitchen on an ordinary evening. The mixture in the center of the flour ring was no longer liquid, but it wasn't quite dough either. It was clumpy and sticky, studded with dry pockets of flour, rough and unpromising. This was the stage that required faith, the stage where you had to trust that what looked like a mistake would, with patience and effort, transform into something smooth and elastic and right. Julian set down the fork and dusted both palms with a light coating of flour. Then, with a breath, began to bring the dough together with fingertips. The remaining flour on the counter, the flour that had formed the outer walls of the well, was gradually incorporated, pressed, and folded into the shaggy mass. It was messy work. Dough stuck to Julian's fingers. Flour flew in small clouds with each movement. The mixture resisted, clumping in some places and remaining stubbornly dry in others. There was a temptation here, Julian recognized, to add too much flour to make it less sticky, or too much water to make it less dry. The temptation to force it, to rush it, to make it easier on yourself. But pasta dough required a specific balance, and you couldn't shortcut your way to it. You had to feel it, adjust gradually, trust your hands to know when it was right. Julian worked slowly, scraping dough off fingers when needed, adding the smallest pinches of flour when areas seemed too wet, pressing everything together with steady, patient pressure. Gradually, the mixture began to cohere. The dry pockets disappeared. The sticky areas grew less tacky. What had been a collection of clumps became a single, unified mass. When it was all together, still rough, still shaggy, but old Julian paused. Flour dust had settled on both wrists and forearms, a fine white powder against skin. The counter was a mess of scattered flour and small scraps of dough. Ravioli still wore her flour mustache with dignity. The kitchen smelled like raw wheat and the faint sweetness of fresh eggs. Julian looked down at the rough ball of dough and felt the first stirring of satisfaction. This was progress. This was the beginning of transformation. And now came the real work. The part that would turn this rough, resistant mass into something smooth and alive. The part that required nothing but time and rhythm and the repetitive motion of hands. The kneading. Julian dusted the counter with a fresh layer of flour and placed the ball of dough at the center. Both palms came down on top of it, and the kneading began. Push with the heel of the hand. The dough flattened slightly, resisting the pressure. Fold the far edge over toward you. The dough doubled on itself. Turn it a quarter rotation. The dough shifted position. Push, fold, turn, push, fold, turn. The rhythm established itself almost immediately. There was no thinking required, no mental calculation. The body knew this motion. Hands had been kneading dough for millennia. The motion was encoded somewhere deep in muscle memory that stretched back through generations. Push, fold, turn. The dough was stiff at first, resistant. It fought back against the pressure, springing back when pushed, reluctant to change shape. But Julian kept going, kept the rhythm steady, and slowly, so slowly something began to shift. Push, fold, turn. Warmth built in Julian's forearms, a pleasant heat from the repeated motion. The muscles engaged, then relaxed, then engaged again. The heel of the hand pressed down, feeling the dough compress beneath it, feeling the slight give, the gradual softening. Push, fold, turn. The surface of the dough, which had been rough and pockmarked with dry patches, began to smooth. The texture changed, becoming more uniform, more cohesive. What had been stiff and unyielding grew more pliable, more responsive. Push, fold, turn. Minutes passed. The clock on the wall ticked. Ravioli settled onto the floor nearby, her flour-dusted whiskers still prominent, her eyes half-closed in contentment. The lamp over the counter cast its small pool of warm light, and beyond it the kitchen had grown fully dark. It might have been any time, any place. Past and present collapsed into this single continuous moment of hands and dough and rhythm. Push, fold, turn. Thoughts rose up during the repetitive motion, as thoughts do when the hands are busy, but the mind is not. Worries from the day drifted through a conversation that had gone slightly wrong, an email that needed answering, a deadline looming. Julian noted them, let them pass, returned to the rhythm. Push, fold, turn. Memories surfaced, unbidden. A grandmother's kitchen, though Julian had never actually watched a grandmother make pasta. Perhaps it was an image from a film or a photograph, or simply an archetype that lived somewhere in the collective unconscious. The idea of grandmothers and kitchens and dough seemed to belong together, seemed to represent something about continuity and care and the patient passing of knowledge through hands. Push, fold, turn. The dough was changing now, truly changing. It had gone from resistant to responsive. Each push met less opposition. Each fold was smoother. The surface had become silky, almost glossy. When Julian pressed the heel of a hand into it, the dough pushed back, not with resistance, but with a kind of aliveness, a springy resilience that said the gluten had developed, the structure had formed, the transformation had occurred. Push, fold, turn. There was something meditative in this, Julian realized. Something that quieted the constant chatter of the mind. The rhythm was like a mantra, the repetitive motion like a prayer. You couldn't think about three things at once while kneading dough. You couldn't plan and worry and regret while your hands were engaged in this simple, patient work. You could only be here now, feeling the dough transform beneath your palms. Push, fold, turn. The sound was gentle as soft shush, 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 as the dough met the floured counter, as the heels of hands pressed and released, as the mass rotated and folded and moved through space. It was rhythmic, almost musical, a quiet percussion keeping time with breath and heartbeat. Push, fold, turn. Julian's mind wandered to the nature of worth, of value. What made something valuable? Complexity? Rarity? Cost? Or was value something else entirely, something that had to do with the care you brought to it, the attention you gave it, the patience you invested? This dough was not complex. 4 ingredients. Nothing rare or expensive. And yet, the process of making it, the care, the attention, the patient work, imbued it with something. Not just value, but meaning. The worthiness of the thing came not from what it was made of, but from the act of making itself. Push, fold, turn. And if that was true of dough, what about people? What about Julian standing here in this quiet kitchen, hands dusted with flour, alone on an ordinary evening? Worth wasn't measured by complexity or achievement, or how much you could produce or how well you performed for others. Worth was inherent. Worth was built into the very fact of existing, of showing up, of bringing care and attention to simple things. You didn't need to be more than this. You didn't need extras or additions or special features. You were enough, exactly as you were, in the same way that flour and eggs and salt and water were enough to make something beautiful. Push, fold, turn. The dough had become smooth now, elastically smooth, the surface like satin. When Julian pressed a finger into it, the indentation slowly filled back in, the dough springing back to shape. This was the sign that it was ready. 10 minutes of kneading, give or take, and the rough, resistant mass had become this, smooth, responsive, alive. Julian stepped back, wiping flour-dusted hands on a kitchen towel. The ball of dough sat on the counter, perfect and complete. Ravioli looked up, blinking slowly, and Julian was struck again by how much the cat resembled the dough, both round, both soft, with the color of cream. The temptation to reach down and knead Ravioli's soft belly, to sink fingers into that plush fur and feel her purr rumble to life, was almost overwhelming. But Ravioli was not dough, and would likely object to being treated as such. Julian settled for running a gentle hand over her head, and the cat leaned into the touch, purring. The dough was ready, but it was not finished. It needed one more thing before it could be rolled and shaped. It needed to rest. Julian wrapped the ball of dough in a clean, soft kitchen towel, tucking the edges around it like swaddling a baby. The dough was placed back on the counter, not in the refrigerator, but at room temperature, where it would remain soft and pliable. Now came the waiting. 30 minutes, at least. Some recipes said an hour. The dough needed time for the gluten to relax, for the moisture to distribute evenly throughout, for everything that had been worked and kneaded and stressed to settle back into equilibrium. You couldn't rush this part. No amount of attention or effort would speed the process. The dough would be ready when it was ready, and not a moment before. Julian filled the kettle with water and set it on the stove to boil. While waiting, the counter was wiped down, clearing away the scattered flour and small scraps of dough that had accumulated during the kneading. The workspace was restored to order, clean and ready for the next phase. The kettle whistled. Julian poured hot water over a tea bag and a favorite mug, something herbal, chamomile and lavender, calming. With the mug in hand, Julian pulled out a chair and sat at the small kitchen table, the one pushed slightly away from the counter where Ravioli had been sitting earlier. The cat immediately appeared and leapt onto Julian's lap, circling once before settling into a compact loaf shape, her paws tucked beneath her chest. Her flower mustache had mostly faded, though a few white specks still clung to her whiskers. She began to purr, a low, steady rumble that vibrated through Julian's legs. The kitchen was quiet. The lamplight over the counter created a small island of warmth in the surrounding darkness. Through the window, night had fully settled. There were no lights on in the neighbor's house, no cars passing on the street. Just the stillness of evening, the comfort of walls and warmth, the simple presence of this moment. Julian sipped the tea, feeling the heat spread from throat to chest. One hand rested on Ravioli's back, feeling the rise and fall of her breathing, the steady thrum of her purr. The other hand held the warm mug, and there was nothing else that needed doing, nowhere else to be, no other demands on attention or time. This was rest, not just for the dough, but for Julian, too. There was a lesson here, a gentle wisdom woven into the process of making pasta. You couldn't force things to completion. Some stages required patience, required waiting, required you to step back and let time do its work. And that waiting wasn't wasted time. It wasn't empty or unproductive. It was essential. It was part of the transformation. The dough needed to rest so the gluten could relax. Without that rest, it would fight against the rolling pin, would snap back into shape, would resist every attempt to thin it into delicate sheets. Rest made the next phase possible. Rest made the dough cooperative, workable, beautiful. And people were the same. Rest wasn't weakness. Rest wasn't laziness. Rest was the necessary pause that allowed for what came next. You couldn't roll yourself thin and expect to hold your shape without tearing if you never allowed yourself time to settle, to breathe, to simply be. Julian looked at the wrapped dough on the counter and felt a kinship with it. We're both resting, Julian thought. We're both becoming ready. The tea was nearly gone. Ravioli had fallen into a light doze, her whiskers twitching occasionally as she dreamed of whatever it is cats dream of. The clock ticked. The house settled with small creaks and sighs, and in the quiet, Julian felt something that had been tight and wound in the chest begin to loosen. This was enough. This moment, this kitchen, this simple act of making something with your own hands. This was more than enough. This was everything. When the 30 minutes had passed, Julian gently shifted Ravioli from lap to chair, earning a small chirp of protest. But the cat simply resettled, curling into the warm spot Julian had left behind. The dough waited, patient and ready. Julian unwrapped the ball of dough from its towel and set it on the freshly floured counter. The difference was immediate and noticeable. The dough that had been firm and elastic after kneading was now softer, more pliable, almost buttery in texture. When Julian pressed a finger into it, the indentation remained, the dough yielding without resistance. This was exactly right. The rolling pin hung on a hook nearby, a simple wooden pin, heavy and smooth from years of use. Julian took it down, feeling the weight and balance of it, the way the handles fit into palms. There was something satisfying about well-made tools, objects designed for a single purpose and shaped by that purpose into their perfect form. The ball of dough was gently flattened with the palm of a hand into a thick disc. Then the rolling pin was set at the center, and the first roll began. Forward. The pin moved away from the body, pressing the dough, spreading it outward. The dough stretched, lengthened, growing thinner beneath the pressure. Lift. The pin came up. Turn. The disc of dough rotated a quarter turn. Forward again. The rhythm was different from kneading, less about repetition, more about gradual expansion. Each roll made the dough a little wider, a little thinner. The circle, not quite a perfect circle, but close enough, grew larger with each pass of the pin. Julian paused to dust the counter with more flour, and to flip the dough over, ensuring both sides were lightly coated and wouldn't stick. The rolling resumed. Forward, lift, turn. Forward, lift, turn. There was a particular kind of attention required here. Too much pressure, and the dough would tear. Too little, and it would never thin. You had to feel the resistance, had to listen with your hands to what the dough was telling you. When it pushed back, you eased up. When it yielded, you continued. The disc grew wider. What had started as thick and dense became gradually thinner, more translucent. The lamplight began to shine through the dough where it was thinnest, revealing the grain of the wooden counter beneath. It was like watching fabric being woven or paper being made. The transformation from thick to thin, from opaque to translucent, felt almost magical. Forward, lift, turn. The rolling pin made a soft, papery rustle with each pass, the sound of wood on dough, of dough on flour, of everything moving together in a quiet symphony of texture. It was a sound Julian had heard in videos, in distant memories, in the collective imagination of what kitchens should sound like. And now it was here, real, being created by Julian's own hands. The sheet of dough was becoming genuinely thin now, thin enough that Julian could see the shadow of fingers through it when holding it up to the light. This was the delicate phase. One careless motion, one uneven pressure, and the sheet could tear. But Julian's movements had found their rhythm, had become confident, without being forceful, gentle, without being tentative. Forward, lift, turn. There was vulnerability in this thinness, Julian thought. The dough had become delicate, had become translucent, had let light pass through it. And yet it was still strong. It hadn't torn, it held together, even in its most refined state. There was something profound in that. The idea that you could be vulnerable and strong at the same time. That thinness, the kind of thinness that let light through, that let people see through to what lay beneath, wasn't the same as weakness. sometimes becoming refined, becoming translucent, becoming willing to let light pass through you, was its own form of strength. The sheet of dough lay on the counter, pale and beautiful, nearly 2 feet across. It was, Julian realized with a quiet surge of pride, absolutely perfect. Ravioli had roused from her nap and was watching from the chair, her eyes gleaming in the lamplight. She seemed to approve, though with cats it was always hard to tell. Julian stood back for a moment, simply looking at what had been created. A sheet of dough, nothing more, but also everything. Simple ingredients, flour, eggs, salt, thyme, transformed through patient effort into something delicate and beautiful. This was the art of it, not in complexity, not in exotic techniques or rare ingredients, but in the care brought to simple things, in the willingness to slow down, to pay attention, to let your hands remember what they had always known. The dough was ready for the final transformation, ready to become pasta. The sheet of dough needed to be cut into ribbons fettuccine, which meant little ribbons in Italian. There was a particular technique for this, one that had been used for generations. The sheet was folded, carefully, like folding a letter. Not creased, just gently laid over itself in loose layers. Julian dusted the surface of the dough lightly with flour to ensure the layers wouldn't stick together, then began to fold. The far edge was brought toward the center, then folded again and again, until the entire sheet was a long, narrow strip of layered dough, perhaps 3 inches wide. The knife came next, a sharp chef's knife, long and clean. Julian positioned it at one end of the folded dough and made the first cut. The blade sliced through the layers cleanly, and when the cut piece was unfolded, a ribbon of pasta fell free. Then another cut, parallel to the first, about a 1/4 inch away. Another ribbon, another cut, another ribbon. The motion became rhythmic. Slice, set aside, slice, set aside. The ribbons began to accumulate, each one a long, delicate strand of pale gold. Julian's movements were careful, but increasingly confident. The cuts weren't perfectly uniform. Some ribbons were slightly wider than others, some a bit narrower. But that was the point, wasn't it? This was handmade. This was human. The small irregularities weren't flaws. They were evidence of the hand that had crafted them, proof that a person had stood in a kitchen and made something real. Machine-made pasta was perfectly uniform, every strand identical. But handmade pasta had character, had the subtle variations that came from being touched and shaped by human hands. Each ribbon was unique. Each one carried the mark of its maker. Slice, set aside, slice, set aside. The pile of cut ribbons grew. When all the folded dough had been sliced, Julian began to carefully shake out each ribbon, unfolding the layers. The strips cascaded free, separate, but still connected at points where they had pressed together during cutting. With gentle fingers, Julian pulled them apart, and they fell into loose, flowing strands. It was like watching something bloom. What had been a compressed, folded mass became a flowing cascade of individual ribbons, each one catching the lamplight, each one a perfect little miracle of transformation. The ribbons were pale gold, the color of wheat and egg yolk. They had a slight sheen where the light hit them. When Julian picked up a small handful, they slipped through fingers like silk, cool and smooth and impossibly delicate. This was what had been created. This was what 4 simple ingredients and patient effort had become. Julian felt a swell of quiet pride, not boastful, not showy, but deep and genuine. I made this, Julian thought. with my own hands, in my own kitchen, with nothing but time and care. I made this. Ravioli approached the counter again, rising on her hind legs to sniff delicately at the ribbons of pasta. Her nose twitched, her whiskers fanned forward, and then she settled back onto all fours, apparently satisfied that the pasta met her exacting standards. The ribbons needed to dry slightly before cooking, needed to firm up just enough to hold their shape in boiling water. Julian looked around for a place to drape them and decided on the back of a wooden chair pulled over near the counter. One by one, the ribbons were carefully lifted and arranged over the chair back, draped like delicate curtains. They hung in loose, graceful folds, catching the light from the overhead lamp, swaying slightly in the gentle air currents of the kitchen. It was beautiful, absurdly, unexpectedly beautiful. The pasta hung from the chair back like something from a painting, long, pale ribbons catching the warm lamplight, casting soft shadows against the dark kitchen. Julian stepped back to take in the full sight of it and felt a tightness in the throat, an unexpected welling of emotion. This was what it meant to create something with your own hands. This was what it meant to take raw materials, flour, eggs, salt, water, and transform them through patient effort into something beautiful. And the beauty wasn't in spite of the simplicity. It was because of it. These ingredients hadn't been rare or exotic. The process hadn't required special equipment or advanced techniques. What it had required was time, attention, care, the willingness to slow down and be present with each stage, to not rush, to trust the process. And those things, time, attention, care, those were things Julian had. Those were things anyone had if they chose to use them. You didn't need to be extraordinary. You didn't need special gifts or talents or resources. You just needed to show up, to pay attention, to work with what you had. The pasta ribbons swayed gently, and Julian felt the lesson of it settle deep in the chest. This is self-love, Julian thought. Not the kind that's loud or performative. Not the kind that requires expensive products or elaborate routines. This kind, the quiet kind. The kind that says, I'm going to spend this evening doing something slow and patient and real just for myself because I'm worth the time and effort. The kind that says, I don't need to be more than I am. I don't need extras or additions or improvements. I am enough exactly as I am, the same way flour and eggs and salt and thyme are enough to make something beautiful. Ravioli was observing from her chair, her eyes half closed in contentment. The kitchen was warm, the light was soft, and the evening had settled into a deep, peaceful quiet. Outside, the world continued, cars passing somewhere distant, wind rustling through trees, the ordinary machinery of life turning. But in here, in this small circle of lamplight, time had slowed to something approaching stillness. Julian reached out and gently touched one of the pasta ribbons, feeling the slight firmness it had developed as it dried, the delicate texture. This had been nothing an hour ago. Separate ingredients, potential, and now it's this. If such transformation was possible for flour and eggs, what transformation was possible for a person? What could you become if you gave yourself the same patience, the same care, the same willingness to trust the process? The thought was both humbling and hopeful. Julian decided to cook some of the pasta. Now, not all of it, just enough for a single serving. The rest could dry completely and be stored for another evening. But right now, after all this work, after all this patience, it felt right to complete the circle, to take what had been made and turn it into nourishment. A pot of water was set on the stove to boil. Salt was added enough to make the water taste like the sea, as the old cooking wisdom said. While the water heated, Julian prepared the simplest possible sauce. Butter melting in a small pan, a squeeze of fresh lemon juice, black pepper cracked from a mill, a pinch of salt. That was all. Anything more would overwhelm the delicate flavor of the pasta itself. The water reached a rolling boil. Julian carefully lifted a portion of the pasta ribbons from the chair back, perhaps a handful, and lowered them into the pot. They swirled in the churning water, the strands separating and dancing. Fresh pasta cooked in moments, not the 8 or 10 minutes of dried pasta. Just 2 or 3 minutes until the ribbons floated to the surface, tender, but with a gentle resistance when bitten al dente, as it should be. Julian used a slotted spoon to lift the pasta from the water, letting excess liquid drain away, and transferred it to the pan with the melted butter and lemon. A quick toss, coating each ribbon in the glossy sauce, and it was done. The pasta was transferred to a wide, shallow bowl. It sat there, steaming gently, the ribbons tangled and glistening, flecked with black pepper. The scent rose up butter and lemon and the weedy fragrance of fresh pasta. Simple, clean, perfect. Julian took the bowl to the small kitchen table, pulled out a chair, and sat down. Ravioli immediately appeared, hopping onto the adjacent chair, her eyes fixed on the bowl with great interest. "You had your dinner already," Julian reminded her, but the cat was unmoved by this logic. Julian twirled some of the pasta around a fork and took the first bite. The texture was immediately noticeable tender, but with body, a gentle chew that machine-made pasta never quite achieved. The flavor was subtle, the taste of good eggs and flour, enhanced by the butter and the bright note of lemon. It was, in a word, perfect. Not perfect because it was complex or fancy or restaurant quality. Perfect because it was exactly what it needed to be. Simple ingredients, patiently prepared, consumed in a quiet kitchen on an ordinary evening. This was nourishment, yes, but it was more than that. It was proof that you could make something beautiful with your own hands. Proof that simple things, given time and care, were enough. Proof that you didn't need to be more than you were. Julian ate slowly, savoring each bite, feeling the warmth of the pasta spread through the body. Ravioli watched with great attention, and when Julian's resolve weakened, a small piece of butter-coated pasta was offered on a fingertip. The cat sniffed it, licked it delicately, and then accepted it with dignity, chewing thoughtfully before deciding it was acceptable. Outside, full night had settled. The window above the sink showed only darkness and the faint reflection of the lamp over the counter. The kitchen was a small world unto itself, warm and safe and complete. Julian looked at the remaining pasta still draped over the chair back, drying in the gentle air. Tomorrow or the day after it would be cooked and eaten. More quiet meals, more simple nourishment. But right now, in this moment, it stood as evidence of what was possible. You didn't need extraordinary ingredients to make something extraordinary. You didn't need special gifts or talents. You needed flour, eggs, salt, and time. You needed patience and care and the willingness to trust your own hands. And if that was true of pasta, it was true of everything else. True of life, true of self-worth, true of the quiet, patient work of becoming who you were meant to be. Julian took another bite, and then another, and felt a deep sense of contentment settle in the bones. The kind of contentment that came from doing something slow and real in a world that often felt too fast and too superficial. The kind that came from honoring yourself enough to spend an evening making something beautiful, even though no one was watching, even though there was no performance or audience or external validation. This was enough. This meal, this kitchen, this quiet evening, this simple act of creation. You are enough, Julian thought, and felt the truth of it resonate. Not as an affirmation that needed to be repeated until you believed it, but as a fact as solid and real as the wooden counter, as true as the flour and eggs that had become pasta. Just like the pasta. Simple ingredients, patiently transformed, nothing more needed, nothing more required. Exactly enough, exactly right. The bowl was empty. The pasta had been eaten, every last ribbon, and Julian sat at the table feeling pleasantly full and deeply, profoundly at peace. Ravioli had received her small treat, a bit of butter-soaked pasta that she accepted as her due and was now grooming her paws with meticulous attention. The kitchen was a gentle mess. Flour still dusted portions of the counter. The rolling pin lay where it had been set down. The pot of pasta water cooled on the stove. The chair near the counter still held draped ribbons of drying pasta, pale and elegant in the lamplight. Julian would clean it all later, or perhaps in the morning. Right now there was no urgency, no pressure. Just the quiet satisfaction of having spent an evening exactly as it should have been spent. The light over the counter glowed warm and steady, a small sun in the darkness of the kitchen. Beyond the windows, the world was quiet. The evening had deepened into night, and somewhere out there people were rushing, striving, reaching for more. But in here, in this small space, Julian had found something else. Enough. Not scarcity dressed up as sufficiency, not resignation disguised as contentment. Real enough. The kind that came from understanding that the most beautiful, complex things in life were made from the simplest ingredients. Flour, eggs, salt, and time. Patience, effort, care, and a little bit of salt to bring out the flavor. You didn't need exotic additions to be worthwhile. You didn't need to be more than you were. The worthiness was already there, built in, inherent. It just needed to be recognized, honored, treated with the same patient care you'd give to a ball of dough that would become something beautiful. Julian looked at the pasta still drying on the chair back and smiled. Tomorrow it would be cooked and eaten. The day after, perhaps more pasta would be made. Or perhaps something else. It didn't matter. What mattered was the lesson that had been learned in this quiet kitchen on this ordinary evening. That you could create something beautiful from almost nothing. That patience was its own ingredient. That simple was not the same as less than. That you, exactly as you were, with nothing added and nothing taken away, were enough, more than enough. Exactly right. Ravioli hopped down from her chair and padded over to Julian, winding between legs in a figure-8 pattern that requested attention. Julian reached down and scratched behind her ears, and the cat's purr rumbled to life, filling the quiet kitchen with its steady thrum. The light over the counter glowed. The pasta dried. The evening settled into its deepest, most peaceful hour. And in the morning, when the sun rose and the day began again, Julian would remember this. Would remember standing in a warm kitchen, hands dusted with flour, creating something beautiful from simple ingredients and patient effort. Would remember that it was enough, that you were enough, that you had always been enough. If this story resonated with you, please consider showing your support with a like and subscribe to Deep Sleep Stories Hub for more quiet nights and restful journeys. Sleep well, dear listener. You are enough exactly as you are.